All right, and this is going to seem redundant, but I think that this is a very simple slide that sort of highlights again the definitions of the key concepts that Mark and Steve already went through. And these are terms that the providers and the audiences are going to need to be familiar with. So the transition, and they sort of imply the same thing, but with different impact, if you will. So transition or switching is sort of like the non-medical switches that we as providers will be doing, would be doing if somebody was on the reference or originator product and needed to switch over to a biosimilar. And so that's a physician directed change from the originator to the biosimilar, or in some cases from the biosimilar to the originator product. Interchangeability is a little bit more controversial because there's no FDA approved indication for interchangeability across any of the biosimilars used for IBD. And this is, and as was mentioned before by Mark and Steve, this is where the same clinical result would be expected and the risks of using the biosimilar are not greater. And interchangeability is not defined or not determined by the insurance companies or the payers or the providers. It's determined by the regulatory or legal authorities, AKA the FDA, based on the totality of the evidence that's presented, which we don't have yet. But interchangeability reflects, for example, multiple switches, the 2 or 3 switches, or the switching from the originator to the biosimilar back to the originator, which we know is happening in clinical practice, but just to be aware, it's not an FDA approved indication. In automatic substitution, it may be something that we have to deal with in the future. And this becomes a little bit more challenging because this is where the switch from the reference product to the biosimilar occurs at the pharmacy level. Now, if this switch occurs, they do need to notify the patient as well as the provider, but sometimes that can be after the fact or while the medications are there. So this is where an issue of transparency comes into play. And while most of these switches are likely going to be inconsequential, I think part of it is how we deliver the message of the biosimilar switch to the patient, which sometimes is missed with these automatic substitutions. So this is just like if you were to prescribe, substitution permitted for, a brand name for, amoxicillin, and then they give a different type of generic versus dispense is written, which technically shouldn't be happening with our biosimilars and their reference products, but it's certainly something that could be happening in the future, particularly as we have more of the injectable biosimilars. We can move on to the next slide. And I think this is a slide just letting you know about the status of the various FDA-approved biosimilars for IBD in the US. And the key take-home point from here is just to highlight that there are a number of them. There are 5 for adalimumab, there's 3 for infliximab, but really to also highlight the unique naming structure. And so for patients, providers, infusion centers, all members of the healthcare team to be aware if a patient's getting the originator product versus the biosimilar, you're looking for this unique 4-letter suffix that's affixed to essentially the biologic construct. So for example, adalimumab, AFZB, infliximab, ABDA, that refers to a biosimilar rather than the originator. And so as you're looking at the product that's being dispensed, this is what you have to look for. This ends up being a little bit of a challenge in our EMR systems because our EMR systems oftentimes only include the prefix, but not the suffix. So that's something that I think that we're going to have to be vigilant about as these switches may be occurring in the future. Before I move on, any questions regarding those first couple slides? Pretty straightforward. It's more about nomenclature and definitions. All right, we can move on to the next slide. So, as we have mentioned over and over again, the FDA has not granted interchangeability for any of the biologics for IBD, infliximab, or adalimumab, although legislation has been enacted for the vast majority of the states in the US. I believe only the states in green have not enacted legislative activity. So there probably will be some movement about this topic in the nearest future. But this just lets you know what's happening in the horizon as well as within the state to state. So most of the states have enacted legislation already. We can move on to the next slide. And I think that this is an important concept to really define and cover with our patients is avoiding the nocebo effect, especially when switching. I think it's a little bit less of an issue when it's a new start for a biosimilar, but for a patient who's been on the reference product or the originator for a long period of time, or had an initial robust response to the originator product and then has to switch, it's about managing the expectations and really defining what the biosimilar is, understanding the construct, the process of biosimilar development, the mechanism of action, and really trying to avoid the nocebo effect, which is adverse events that are produced by negative expectations of a drug. So inherently you feel as though you're getting an inferior product when it truly is biosimilar. And this is where the robust data that Steve and Mark already presented can actually help bolster the confidence of switching from a reference to a biosimilar product. And it is not at all a direct result of any specific pharmacologic action of the drug. So it's not a mechanism of action, it's more of a perception of inferiority that leads to this nocebo effect. And it can occur with any medications, not just placebo drugs. And so it's about framing the context of why the biosimilar is appropriate for that context. But it's also for us as providers and the people we're educating to be aware of the appropriate context where we should be using biosimilars versus scenarios where we shouldn't. And so the key point is screening and education to mitigate potential nocebo effects, and ensuring patient comfort with the switches in therapy is key. And this is where our understanding and expanding the understanding universally of biosimilars, how they're created, the FDA approval process, and truly the rigorous metrics that are used to demonstrate non-inferiority in terms of efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity is important. Any questions about the nocebo effect? All right.
You got any tips on how you're going to explain this to patients? Because I have, plenty who, going even from brand name to generic, really struggle and feel like they're getting screwed.
And I think part of it is, and I think that this is a great time to ask the group how they address this. I think it depends on the context of which the biosimilars are used, and really, and as we ourselves have more familiarity and more experience using the biosimilars, and we see that there's really not a lot of adverse or negative impact of it, that becomes increases our confidence. But basically, I tell them it's really the same thing, right? And then we look at we really go through the rigorous process of how it's approved, and that the fact that there are randomized controlled trial data comparing this to the originator product. There's plenty of studies looking at it in even in the IBD context, including randomized controlled trials, including switches. It's been used in Europe and East Asia for quite some time. The efficacy and immunogenicity profile is the same, the monitoring is the same, and really just emphasizing that this is not just a cost savings measure, and it's not compromising the quality of their care. But that's how I usually frame it. But I'd love to hear how others who have a lot more experience, like Miguel, how do you usually frame the context of switching to a biosimilar to your patients?
Well, even before Miguel, what we haven't heard from the APPs, and I think that they may actually be closer to this situation than some of us may. Of course, Miguel accepted, but you guys, you should chime in regarding how to talk to patients about these.
All right, open forum. Please let us know, because I think
I don't want to dissuade Miguel from answering your question, but I want to hear from the APPs here.
I'm happy to be included as an APP.
Aren't we all, though?
You are advanced.
So this is Norma. I totally agree when you speak with your patients and give them all the information needed, and that you are very familiar with the drug and also the side effects and everything that goes on, and that this is not actually going to harm them, but let's try it and let's see how they're going to react, and the efficacy also with the new drugs and with the biosimilars. I don't know.
Just say that.
I'm sorry. I don't know if the other APPs have the same.
It's how we present this to the patient. if you present to the patient is, listen, we're going to switch you to this other form of infliximab. We've got a lot of experience and data from it. It's going to save money across for everybody, maybe not for you, but it's totally acceptable. Versus, well, we have this other treatment. You might get forced into using it. You know, it's how you present these things to the patient. If you present it in a direct and positive manner versus a negative, questioning, sarcastic, oh, it's your insurance company's problem, you know, then it's going to be different and they're going to feel differently about it.
Steve, I agree. We had, I think it depends on, there's two scenarios. One is your institution is making the switch, and the other is your patient calls you because their outside infusion center or home infusion is changing. The latter one to me is a very short, simple conversation. I think one of the things they're concerned about in that situation is that their out of pocket is going to go up because of the different, because they're already in a copay assistance program, and how's that going to affect them? And I think once they're reassured that their patient, that first of all, there's no drop in efficacy, and second, that the patient support services are virtually identical. In fact, my nurses think that the Pfizer programs are easier to use than the Janssen programs for the biosimilar. When you're making a transition in your center, I think it takes longer because you have to make sure that everyone's speaking the same language. The infusion nurses are educated into the biosimilar, that the nurse coordinators are speaking the same language. You have educational materials. And importantly, you give them time to talk to their provider about the switch. And then we told them in Maryland that, listen, it's not going to be more money in your pocket, but it is allowing us to save money so that we can reinvest in the program. And that allowed us to integrate a clinical pharmacist. So I think it's two different conversations to have with the patients.
Yeah, I think the patient savings program aspect is key because most of the, I'm pretty sure all of the biosimilar manufacturers have almost equivalent patient savings program as Humira Complete or Janssen CarePath. So really just making sure that your teams are informed as to the enrollment processes for those, because they don't want to be on something that would cost them additional money.
So it's interesting, in January of 2019, when Cleveland Clinic went through switch for every indication. So this was rheumatology, derm, GI, I think there are 120,000 patients. And leading up to that, the angst amongst physicians, some were very resistant to this, was kind of interesting. But what the specialty pharmacy and our pharmacist did, which was wonderful, is we had to send letters, which is not a good way to do this because patient gets a letter saying they're switching and that leads to invariably the calls. But the pharmacist actually had kind of a hotline for the pharmacist to talk to the patients. And I'd say 90% were reassured. About 10% then came to the provider. So whether it was the APP or the physician or whatever, that was a kind of a big bolus initially. Since then, it's really died down. And I have to say now that it's been almost 2 years in, we rarely get these. I have some patients, the nocebo effect, where they'll know they switched and they'll start having symptoms. They hadn't had any blood work in a little bit. I know this is all psychological. I'll just get like some, I won't even do levels. I'll just get like a CRP and a CBC and I'll say, oh, your blood work looks fine. Let's see how you do at the next infusion. So it is the way you communicate it proactively, but usually it's now, if we are to react to it, it's a small occurrence, but that's when I hear it. Oh, I know that last one I switched and now I'm feeling X, Y, and Z. And it's like anything we manage. You can talk them through, reassure, and then usually by the next infusion, they're fine.
And I think that this is where knowing well in advance that the switch is going to occur is key, because we've certainly had instances at infusion centers where neither the provider nor the patient were aware that the switch to the biosimilar was occurring until the day of the infusion, which led to a lot of distraught conversations from the patients because they just didn't have the time to have that educational piece, and also the providers didn't have a chance to process what was going on. That's happened to not only myself but a couple of my colleagues. So
Well,
I think.
Oh, sorry, Tina.
Oh no, that's.
So this is good by the AGA to do this, because this actually reminded me, I had 3 faculty we just hired from different parts of the country that are working in different parts of our center. All 3 of them called me recently, because we use Renflexis, just to be transparent. All 3 of them called me and said, are you sure we can use Renflexis? I think I have to use Remicade. And these are the physicians. So you can imagine the conversation they would have had with the patients. And so there's still a lot of educational value out there for not only the patients, but for the physicians.
I just want to add in.
Hence why we're here.
Yeah, just want to add in from my own experience. I think having our staff also be aware, because often the patients are calling our nurses or biologic coordinators or medical assistants. And I think it's important that everyone's on the same page. We need to make sure we educate our own staff, because if they're like, oh, biosimilar, I don't know, and let me find out, and that can already get the patient scared about it. But if they are already aware and they said, oh yeah, this is completely fine, we've used it on several of our patients, they do fine, it's exactly, shouldn't say exactly, but similar to the reference product, et cetera. If they're aware and they reassure the patient, then once the patient even typically they don't even get to us from the physician perspective of calling us concerned, because our nurses and our frontline workers have already reassured the patient.
Monique and Joy, are we anticipating that the AGA is going to have a patient-facing forward brochure or something to hand out?
I am glad you mentioned that, and we can talk about that at the closing of the meeting, but that is exactly what we are working on for this program, where we are developing some materials for patients to be able to download. We're also developing a patient video, real live patients talking about their experiences on a biologic, hopefully on biosimilars, and just having those conversations with their doctors, and then talking about their quality of life to reinforce what all of you will be sharing with providers. So yes, we are in the process of developing that now, and that will be another piece of another resource that will be available on the website as we continue to flush it, fill it with materials for this program. So yes, to Dr. Hanauer's question, and we can talk about this quickly at the end, but one of the things that would be very helpful to us in talking to this group is in thinking about if there are people that patients of yours who you may have now on biosimilars and have had these conversations that you think would be willing to talk to other patients for this program that we can have do video interviews with, please let me know. So the short answer to Dr. Hanauer's question is absolutely.
But Ray just sent us a note saying there already is a video out there for patients from AGA. But I haven't heard from Aaron. Do you have any other comments from APP perspective on this, or is there anything we are missing from either information for the APPs or information that you want to transmit?
So everything that everyone's touched up on is similar to what my approach was. And it was kind of the similar conversations I've had with patients when we had a transition from, Lialda to oral mesalamine. And some people have told us that they've noticed a difference. And then I would either do, like Dr. Ruggiero said, either a CRP or even a fecal calpro 3 months after the switch. And then that provided them some reassurance. So it's very similar to what everyone's touched up on. And just that it's nice that there's another option available, and it's similar.
Thank you.
I could also add something. So something quite interesting here in California is that it's actually the threshold for having someone start on biologic is quite high, and it's more from the patient side, where they're quite resistant. And over here, a lot of folks are interested in like naturopathic or homeopathic type approaches for treatment. And what I've actually found to be helpful for them to even start biologic. And at the same time, also for switching biologics is sometimes just showing the data and, explaining to them, and not necessarily in very technical terms about, what the considerations are from the standpoint of efficacy and safety. And you brought up something quite interesting earlier where you mentioned how, even the originator product infliximab has evolved over time. And at the same time, the one in the United States versus the one in Europe are also quite different. In which case, we still expect the similar efficacy and safety profiles for those medications. So we could also kind of craft it for the patient, saying that on one hand, for the most part, these are all pretty much identical. And as you also then show, what Mark's data and are about, the safety and efficacy, hopefully those also help allay some of their concerns.
So this is Nana. I did a study a couple of years ago at 2 different APP conferences where I looked at how APPs were comfortable or their knowledge base on using biosimilars. This is when we had started to see the influx of biosimilars in the GI world. And the key thing is lack of education. We are really great teachers, but it's hard to teach something that we don't know. So I think this is really a great program to do and also be able to share with my APP colleagues around the world or around the country, just to kind of get them a little bit more comfortable with the information and data. Because we do a lot of teaching, but it's hard to do that, disseminate that information when you don't have a starting background. And also, I think it'll be good to do a program with the nurses, the infusion nurses, and the nurses who answer our phones in the offices as well, because they do a lot of teaching with our patients as well.
Yeah, completely agree. All great points. Any other comments about the conversations about switching or starting a biosimilar for patients?
I have a quick question. Did any of the, and this may tail back to Dr. Osterman, but did any of the studies talk about potentially using pre-meds with the switch of brand to biosimilar? Because I have had other physicians in outside facilities say, well, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it with pre-medications just to cover bases. And we all use it differently, but that's been a question that's come up a lot.
The studies I've seen haven't mentioned pre-meds, so their reason is just the way they were with reference product. I don't know, Steve.
I know what I'm going to say is, why would you need to do that?
I agree, but
don't say it's okay. Say, why would you need to?
I agree. I mean, so, but and maybe that's a point that should be brought up during the discussions of these programs as well, is that you treat the biosimilar just like you would treat the reference product. And so if you're not going to pre-medicate the reference product, why would you pre-medicate the biosimilar?
Yeah, I think it came from the concern of the multiple switches and things like that. So from an immunogenicity standpoint, that's all. So.
All right, why don't we move on to the next slide? So I think we're all very familiar with this, but as we're kind of presenting the context of where we would, as prescribers, utilize biosimilars, I think it's very obvious for brand new starts. It's the reference product or the biosimilar. Oftentimes, as we know, these are more mandated or dictated by the payers or the insurers rather than the providers themselves. But, to be fair, there's really no difference. You dose escalate, you de-escalate, you check for drug monitoring the exact same way. For primary responders, and in this context, we mean, for example, somebody who's responded to induction infliximab or induction adalimumab and now has to be put on maintenance. So as we were discussing earlier, the context where the first 3 infusions may be approved at one setting and then they have to move to a different setting. If they're doing well and they're responding with the expected, using the same metrics that you would, regardless if it's reference or biosimilar, then you can switch to the biosimilar and use the same monitoring strategies, treat to target, therapeutic drug monitoring, that you would for reference. for people who've been in long-term stable remission or stable response on a stable dosing of the reference product or the biosimilar, then you can switch from the biosimilar to the reference and the reference to the biosimilar with the same monitoring strategies. And that's really where the majority of the clinical studies we're looking at was this non-medical switch. So the majority of our data is for this third rectangle, not necessarily the others. And if, but for the same reasons that we wouldn't necessarily go from reuse reference product later on if they have high levels of antibodies or they were a primary non-responder to the originator product or the biosimilar. There's no reason to switch to the biosimilar or the originator because you're switching apples for apples. So I think that this is actually very clear, and hopefully the definitions are very clear to give to an audience. But, you know, I want to pause here and ask, you know, I think that we all know this, but in reality, how would we address other scenarios where we may be asked to change to a biosimilar? So for example, somebody's admitted to the hospital, and I think, I don't want to put you on the spot, Bincy, but I feel like I recall you telling in a session talking about getting a patient in the hospital getting a reference product or a biosimilar, and then their next doses were a switch, and then they may have had to have multiple switches simply because of where they were initially started on the treatment and where their insurers made them continue on. So are there any concerns about switching during active disease or prior to reaching any of these endpoints?
Tina, you have a great memory. That was in our Louisville ACG conference. Wow. Yeah, so that was actually a true scenario where the patient got initial induction as an outpatient with Remicade, the originator biologic, and then got to the hospital where they only used the biosimilar. And in order to continue with it, they had to use the biosimilar, and there was no way of trying to get through the pharmacy to cover the originator, even though they were just going to the induction. So it wasn't the ideal time to make that biosimilar switch, but it had to occur. And then when the patient went back to outpatient, then they had to go back to the originators. There are already two switches happening within weeks of each other. So I think the key here is that's not the ideal situation. And if you can work on appealing it, it all depends on where you're getting the biosimilar, what's the official requirements from either from the hospital, pharmacy, et cetera. But again, it's not the best place to switch. But if the patient's not going to end up having any medication and they're sick enough to be in the hospital, then you have to do what you have to do.
And obviously that's far more of a challenging scenario than, you know, these basic scenarios that we're presenting here. But I think that this also falls into managing expectations, addressing the nocebo effect too, by going from one to another. But, you know, just pausing here, any questions or concerns about this particular slide or this the scenarios for biosimilar use?
I agree with Bincy. I think that we all would like to have a multiple switch study in IBD. I'm not sure that we're going to see that, but I think pragmatically it doesn't make a difference. You know, with limited coordinator time, that I probably wouldn't. I'm fairly sure I wouldn't even utilize any coordinator time to try to appeal it. I would just tell the patient I think it's not an issue, it's okay, and just get the biosimilar from their next dose. I really don't think it's an issue.
In my perspective, it's far worse to be late when you need to be on time, be from an immunogenicity and loss of response perspective, than it is to try to appeal for something that likely isn't worth it. There's an unknown incremental benefit, but there is a sizable incremental risk.
I think the other part of it is that there are times when we absolutely should not make the switch. And I think that's something we need to educate everyone on, is when they develop anti-drug antibodies to the originator or the biosimilar, you don't want to switch them to a biosimilar or vice versa, because that is going to be detrimental in the sense of, you know, they have already developed the anti-drug antibodies, infusion reactions, et cetera. So there's times when it's not ideal. We don't necessarily have all the data, but there's times when it's absolutely should be contraindicated.
And I think that's a great transition to the next slide. And this kind of reiterates those concepts that some of the concepts, and we have a couple other slides later on that Bincy just mentioned. So I think it's really key to just educate the providers and the patients that it's the exact same positioning as the reference products. So wherever you would use the reference products, you could use the biosimilars and for new starts. And the immunogenicity management is the exact same as it would be for the reference product. If there's primary non-response, you use the same strategy. You don't switch an apple for an apple. However, if there is, a pause or a lapse in treatment, so a drug holiday, or they've discontinued therapy, you're not obligated to use the reference product. You certainly can use the biosimilar, the rechallenge, with or without an immunomodulator, depending on the context of the discontinuation. So the concepts of using combination therapy with the anti-TNFs remain the same, whether or not you're using the reference product or the biosimilar. So we're not introducing a new class of medications. We're just adding more to the arsenal of our currently available anti-TNFs. So the same concepts for managing anti-TNFs is the same. Is there? All right. So why don't we, so the next 4 slides are, so we can move on to the next slide, and I think we can press it again, because I think a clinical question would pop up. So the next 4 slides are 4 different case scenarios that are meant to kind of guide discussions into some of the key concepts that have been reiterated through some of the data-driven slides earlier on the process of biosimilar development, as well as the efficacy, immunogenicity, and PK/PD data. And so this is just an example case to reference as a discussion point. It's essentially a new start of a patient who has moderate to severe ulcerative colitis who needs to start an anti-TNF, and her insurance only only approved the biosimilar. And so this sort of introduces the concept of the nocebo effect, what biosimilars are, and some of the efficacy data. Let's move on to the next case. And so this is a case of a primary non-responder who has positive levels and no antibodies. So the question, and so this raises the concept of, are biosimilars appropriate in this particular context, to discuss with the audience? We can move on to the next case. This is somebody who's had a long-term response and who's been on reference product or originator infliximab, and due to a change in insurance, her new insurance, insurer only approves the biosimilar. So this is talking about that non-medical or stable remission switch, to introduce that concept and to go over some of the data. And then I think our final case is the next slide. Somebody who's had a loss of response, who clearly has developed immunogenicity, and to highlight the point that this is not necessarily somebody who would be a candidate for using an adalimumab biosimilar, but potentially an infliximab biosimilar, because they lost response and developed immunogenicity to adalimumab. And we would use the same, practice for using combination therapy for patients who've developed antibodies to one anti-TNF, like we would for infliximab biosimilars. So let's move on to the next slide. And I think that this kind of, again, highlights a lot of the concepts that Bincy mentioned in terms of positioning or how we would use biosimilars. And I think the key point is, I think bullet points 2 and 3 are sort of reiterating some of the discussion that we had with that considerations versus concern slide that was in Mark's session. But the 4th bullet point is really where we're emphasizing areas where we would not switch. So primary non-response, high-risk disease flare if a stable dosing regimen has not been identified yet. However, I think that may be a little bit of context there, because that alludes to the example that you gave, Bincy, because if there is no other choice and you have to use the biosimilar, even if they do have active disease, you can still optimize the dosing of the biosimilar the same way that you would optimize the dosing of the reference product. If you have to,
we should eliminate that sentence.
Yeah, because I'm looking at that too.
No
and
different than, with a really sick patient on any of the other TNFs, so Inflix, Remicade, or whatever. You're still uncertain of it early on. I don't think it's different than the reference product here.
So I would agree, because I'm looking at that now and talking out loud, that doesn't as much sense. Although I think that we would agree that pregnancy is kind of a special consideration. So, but again,
you wouldn't switch in a pregnant woman?
Well, I think it's a special consideration. And I think that if you if push came to shove and you had no other choice, you have to switch. But if there are a way to keep them on it, I think a lot of people would have concerns about switching during pregnancy, although it's not data driven. Does anybody?
I've said this before as well when I've given talks on this, that it's sensitive times in people's lives that maybe making the switch isn't appropriate. And it's not logical based on data, but again, do you need to stress out a pregnant woman with a switch, and like someone who's about to have a trip of a lifetime who you're switching like right before the trip? Like
the nocebo potential there is higher, I think.
Right. I think it's the nocebo is potentially higher. And so, I might change that third bullet point there and say that we have safety data on multiple switches in psoriasis, but not IBD, because that's framed a little bit more positively. And then the other thing I might say is we're doing treat to target, right? So ideally, before anyone made a switch, you've confirmed that they're in deep remission, that their drug levels, we're all doing proactive TDM, so they have a therapeutic drug level, right? So I think making sure that your patient's in deep remission before the switch. So if you think that the symptoms are due to nocebo or flare, can be very helpful. I just would adjust that last one a little bit.
Are we all doing proactive?
The only thing I want to say, I think more and more that biosimilars are out, the less and less that any of this becomes a discussion. I think we have to be a little bit careful, and Ray and Tina, I understand exactly what you're saying, but to me, unless we see some compelling data to the opposite, I think more and more this is just the norm. And I think if we get into needing to check for deep remission, needing to check levels, not using in certain circumstances, that's actually going to just lead to more confusion. I can't tell you how many times a day I get called from the region and I'm like, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Just use it and move on. Because every time we pause and say, well, you can get this, you could do this, then it leads to that uncertainty. So I don't mean to be too black and white harsh about it, but I think we have to be careful when we present that we're actually doing this.
I do want to be black and white harsh. I mean, these are your individual, I agree with, these are challenges, but I disagree with using them as examples of when I wouldn't switch. I think it undermines the entire concept of the whole presentation here. These are safe.
To be fair, this is a sort of a more negative spin on the slide that we had 5 slides ago about positioning biosimilars. So I think that, this is really, this can be eliminated, and these are potential additional discussion points that can be had during the conversation after a talk.
Yeah, I agree. And this could be basically just the point would not switch. The whole slide could be where we would not switch. Okay, I think that that's really the key aspect. And even consider checking antibodies before a switch. You would, if you're going to check for levels in your practice on the reference, you would check it, but it doesn't change anything here. Right. I think we can't undermine the concept of this with these insidious individual issues of going on a vacation or pregnancy or sick patients. That's just undermining uncertainty or bringing out uncertainties that really don't belong.
And the only other reason so Steve, yeah, I think you and I are agreeing on this part, and not that the others are disagreeing. I think it's just that there's sensitivity around uncertainty, and that's why we're having this discussion. But I think it's reasonable to put a statement somewhere that the new reality is this is going to occur and it's okay. And some of it is going to be hard for us to even manage when we know it's occurring, even though we're notified. So I think it's more to reassure that this is fine. There's no problem with it.
So I think that, Joy, this is reasonable to definitely hide from the deck, if not eliminate. And I'm looking at the chat box, and Sid had a question for everyone about, for patients with a vague intolerance to originator, what would switching to a biosimilar be advisable? And so Sid, I'm presuming that you mean by vague intolerance, meaning not the standard infusion-related reactions, but more fatigue or my teeth hurt.
But I
Yes,
would
correct. I mean,
say-
something that's totally unrelated. You know that it's probably unrelated to the medication.
But
Well,
that's
if you would
that's going to be the same with
redose
Remicade.
them, if you'd redose them with the same drug, then you can redose them with the similar.
Yep.
So
Can we offer it as an alternative and say, hey, how about we try a biosimilar? You know, just like we, you know, for PPIs, we switch between PPIs. If somebody has an intolerance to one, we go to Acifex because we think it's the least potent and probably the best.
That's a
best
different drug,
tolerated.
however. Sid, that's a different drug. That would be switching
Okay.
from infliximab to adalimumab, not
Okay.
switching between infliximab and the biosimilar.
Fair enough.
I think that the way that I put it is, if you're going to do something with Remicade, you would do something with the biosimilar. So if they're having this
Exactly.
mild vague intolerance, which, not to say it this way, might be psychosocially driven, it could be the patient, it could be whatever, and we're switching to biosimilar, I would say it's you know, if you're having the symptom, the Remicade, it's as if you're getting another Remicade. We need to address those symptoms, but it has nothing to do with the switch.
Fair enough. Thank you.
I think we can come up with a better would not switch if primary non-response, antibodies to the originator, infusion reactions or reactions to the originator,
Well, it's
loss
anything
of response to the originator.
anything you would do with the originator, or anything you would think about with originator infliximab would apply. And then whatever statements you would put, that's fine.
Yeah, I think this is a bad slide, coming back to it.
Hey, Joy, can we go back 5 slides to the slide before the cases? Because I think that this is the slide that we should just use and leave it at that. Oh no, 1 slide ahead. This one right here. And so from what I'm hearing is that that other slide is unnecessary, and if not unnecessarily controversial. And this one is more to the point and the only one we need.
I agree.
All right. So now we can skip ahead to the patient education section, which is the next slide. So this is more just a couple of slides to talk about the discussion. And by the same token, it also lists the FDA link to kind of the biosimilar education piece for the patients. That's more of an infographic, but kind of that we were all discussing already about how to frame the conversation about using biosimilars, being familiar with the definitions and being able to define that to the patient, emphasize that this is not a brand new medication. It's essentially an iteration of what they're getting right now, and that there's no change in the indications in the dosing. Next slide. And I think that, and from the reassurance perspective, emphasizing that it's not compromising quality of care for costs of care. And this is where the patient savings piece also comes into play, because we need to make sure that it's not costing them more out of pocket. And it doesn't change any of your monitoring strategies and your treat to target endpoints, right? So, and this may be a little bit out of place and may be better off in some of the other sections about the immunogenicity and therapeutic drug monitoring, but essentially the monitoring strategies are exactly the same. And this is from the AGA guidelines. So let's pause there and then go to the next slide, and then we'll have a relatively brief conversation about the reimbursement and economic considerations, since a lot of this is not necessarily within the provider perspective. But before we do that, any other questions about the conversation or setting up the clinical context to begin the discussions about biosimilars when you're giving these talks? All right, so let's move on to the next slide. And you know, this is a little bit of a challenging slide, because you know, it's basically who is benefiting from the use of the biosimilars? Is it predominantly the payers? Is it the facilities? Is it It's not really the physicians, but or how much of it is the patients. And I think that there's a lot of variability depending on region, depending on the cost to the institution, the reimbursements, as well as what is in the various formularies. I think the key take-home point is to be familiar with the various biosimilar savings programs that are available to the patients. Overall, the cost savings isn't really to the patients, it's more to the insurers and potentially to the healthcare systems. But just throwing it out there to the group, how would you approach the topic of where is the savings coming from with the biosimilars?
Well, we need to change the slide.
Yeah, I agree.
Shouldn't be plus plus. I mean, patients should be plus minus. In general, neutral for them, unless, as Miguel said, it's a forced savings by making them switch. But there's no way that should be plus plus for patients.
Yeah, I think it's meant to be a plus minus throughout.
What's the value of this slide anyway?
I would get rid of it.
I think it's still uncertain. As I said, if we start increasing the number of people, hopefully, who have access to these drugs and start using it in milder whatever, if we expand the market, I don't know how to talk about cost savings along these lines.
And I think there are
necessary.
Too many scenarios too.
And my feel is that in the U.S., in Europe and other countries, it's about access. In the U.S., this is about people getting a piece of the pie, dude. For me, this isn't anything about access. This is 100% about other companies making a ton of money off these drugs that are making an enormous amount of money. Like, this is what it's about here. It's about competition and about more people getting a piece of the pie, as opposed to like 70% cheaper other countries where people can actually get access to it, or Eastern Europe,
So Joy, just out of curiosity, is this is cost savings an objective that we have to discuss as part of this topic?
No, if it's as all of you have been discussing, if it's not applicable or just in reality doesn't really make sense to frame it that way, no, not at all.
I think it actually works against the overarching message about utilizing biosimilars, because if you're saying it's not really going to result in patient savings, and it's going to, I don't know if it necessarily fits with the tone of the overall presentation, because like I said, the use of biosimilars isn't necessarily a provider-based, it's not solely based on the provider's preference.
All that I think it ends up doing at the end of the day is reduce the innovator's cost on the market. But after being on the market for 10 years and making billions and billions of dollars, that reduction is not insignificant, but that's what I mean, I hate to sound cynical about it, but I think that's really the only thing that we're seeing. And you could argue it's not a savings necessarily to anybody. So I agree, I probably wouldn't keep this slide in.
And if we were to go to the next slide, I'm not quite sure there's a lot of value having this slide either. Who will benefit from the 20 to 30% cost savings? Because the overarching theme of this is not really sure who's going to benefit, but it's not the patients.
Yeah, I would dump it.
Next.
Just a quick question. Do you know who proposed the legislation for biosimilars?
Was it driven through the FDA, the BPCI?
Sorry, that came from Congress.
Congress, I think.
I don't know who supported that bill.
Congress.
I mean, I guess we could look it up.
Wasn't it part of the Affordable Care Act?
Yes.
I think it was.
Yes.
I think it was part of it.
Don't you think, though, this is a good slide to at least bring up the concept of, wait a minute, are we really saving money or not? Like, I think, yes, we talked about in the beginning, there's a potential for cost savings, but then, I mean, this is like a big question that people end up asking in all these meetings. So I think this is good to say, hey, wait a minute, where's the data?
Well, I showed you data from Norway, right?
Right, but for us,
again, that doesn't apply to us,
right?
Because Norway, it's as I said in the very beginning, the European systems are national, and that's where they see the savings. And here we are, capitalists where we don't have a health system.
It's competition here. That's it. So who can get you a better deal?
Well, I mean, maybe looking at it in a more optimistic sense, we know the cost of care is going up, biologic use is going up. And if you can have some less costly drugs enter the market, maybe we can blunt that curve a little bit. So I think maybe viewing it in an optimistic way, biosimilars could help in that way. I think if you're going to include a slide on cost, I think this is very fair. It opens up some of the points that Steve was alluding to about access and overall costs, and maybe, you know, if you're going to include one, I don't have a problem with this slide. I think this is very fair if you're going to include it.
Although you could add that the originator might end up being cheaper than the biosimilar. Like it's probably not fair to assume that the biosimilar is going to be cheaper. So, you know, there's deals with entire portfolios.
But the point being, if the biosimilars entering the market force the innovator to drop their cost and contain costs, that's probably a good thing as well, right? So how you get there probably doesn't matter.
But devil's advocate, if the cost is lower and access is greater, and then an uptake of biologic is higher, doesn't that actually increase cost?
That's what Steve was saying, yeah. I guess it depends on what cost we're talking about, right?
Because right now, isn't it, didn't you say 2% uptake or 4%, but 40% of the cost, something like that?
2% of the use in Americans, 40% of the cost in dollars. Yep.
So you increase the uptake by decreasing, because I don't know if the net decrease in the cost of the biosimilar would offset, let's say, a 20% uptake in use. Probably not, based on the math. But then there are downstream effects of hospitalization, surgeries, et cetera, that have to be factored into like things like qualities. Anyways, well, you know, what I would say is, you know, I think we're all in agreement that the previous slide with the table is unnecessary. We can leave this other slide in the slide deck, and during your discussions based on your audience, it's a slide that you may use and place into context of where we're really seeing the cost savings, and how, just to start a discussion for the group you're presenting to. All right, let's go to the next slide. I think this is my, the last slide in this section before there's a few, actually no, this may be outstanding questions and concerns. I think this is more just as a, this isn't necessarily a slide that has to be, that's meant to be presented. It's more just to raise questions as you're looking through the slide deck for discussion later on. But I think we've covered quite a lot of this. The data on mucosal healing we discussed earlier, not necessary. Repeated switching, I think that's a unknown. That's we can reference some of the psoriasis data, but I think that a lot of this has already been discussed previously, so it's a little bit redundant.
I think this is, I don't think we need this slide either. We need some other, is this the concluding slide?
Yeah, the next slide's the concluding slide. So, so if we can go one ahead. And the only thing about, so this is the, I think we like the word considerations a lot as a group. But the first point, it's really about addressing the, trying to blunt nocebo effect through patient education. The first through 4 points, 5 points. I think that we could probably eliminate the PK status before making any non-medical changes, because I think that that's a little bit provider specific, not necessarily universal. So we can cross that one out. And the last point.
Several we can modify here.
Yeah.
Because I think the point that we've made repeatedly is that use the biosimilar the same as you would use the originator. Okay, that's what you would do for the PK status. You know, it's no different than the originator.
And again, if the goal here is to have positive framing, I think that's what the AGA wants. Yeah. That last bullet, I would say something about that we do have data in other disease states that multiple switches appears to be safe. So that ends up having a positive spin to it.
Yeah, so I would probably make that so emerging data regarding safety and efficacy, safety of non-medical switching across multiple biosimilars, make that maybe the next to last bullet point, but the final bullet point should just be emphasizing, position it in the same way that you would position the reference products, or something, something more final from that end. Any other thoughts about this particular section of the slide deck? Again, it's more of the clinical context of the biosimilars with which to frame some of the more data and evidence-driven slides from Mark and Steve's presentations. as you're creating your own decks. I think the last couple of slides are just, the last slide is just resources that are available from the Foundation, the FDA, and the AGA.